Since I chose as my theme for the month of November the notion of piercing the veil or the illusion of death, I decided today to read with an essay I wrote in January of 2020 on encountering a dead oak tree in my property. Don't judge a book by its cover, nor a tree by its lack of cover. A cursory glance on my morning walk showed me a desiccated skeleton, a pitiful, emaciated, barkless tree, apparently pointing an accusatory finger at God. Stripped of skin and flesh, of muscles, tendons, and vital organs, it stood gaunt and shriveled to the side of the path. I felt a deep pity for it, this once elegant, majestic oak tree, now looking like a terminally ill cancer patient ravaged by illness and chemotherapy, with hollow cheeks and vacant eyes. So I hugged it, and then it spoke to me. Do you really think I'm dead? Open your eyes, your mind, your imagination, and your soul. I'm not dead. I'm serving. Thousands of grubs and insects have homes deep in my body. Entire generations of them have been born and lived out their lives here. One of my limbs fell off some years back. There it lies on the ground, colonized by a mycelium, birthing mushrooms, waiting for a psychonaut to ingest some and experience a radically altered state of consciousness, exploring new dimensions filled with elementals and mystical visions. I am not a corpse. I am a life giver. I am a passage through the veil. And what about you, oh human being? Whom are you helping to live? Whom have you escorted through the veil, huh? Then I understood that the finger pointing at the sky was not an accusation, it was a signpost giving me directions. These are words inspired by God. So for our new companions today, it's my custom. I take a theme for a month. I develop it for the first 2 Sundays. And then on the 3rd Sunday, I do a recap and then open it up to a question and answer. And so for the month of November, I've taken the theme of thin places or piercing the veil. And I spoke about it for 2 Sundays in a row. So today I'm going to do a quick recap of what I covered and then open it up to Q&A. So 2 weeks ago, I talked about the notion of thin places and Celtic feasts. We have a phrase in Gaelic, it's called a ÓLaoire. A ÓLaoire is a thin place where the veil between the mystical and the mundane is diaphanous, and beings can pass through from either side. And so a ÓLaoire is basically a kind of a portal. And a portal for the Celts could be a special place, a location, like a lake, or it could be a wood, or it could be a single sacred tree, standing alone, a white thorn bush or an oak tree. And that's certainly what I encountered on my walk, 4 years ago, when I saw this desiccated, this single thing, spearing the sky, and then having the conversation with it. So for me, I realized I had just wandered into a ÓLaoire, into a portal. It could be for us Celts, it could be a ÓLaoire could be a hill or a mountain, or it could be a graveyard or a church, because Irish Celtic Christianity was not based on the Roman model of a parish and a diocese, but it was based on the hut of a hermit, because Egyptian desert fathers and desert mothers seeking more remote areas sailed across the Mediterranean, out through the States of Gibraltar, up the west coast of Europe, and landed in Ireland, and found very isolated places in the woods where they created their hermitages. And the local population realized these were holy men and holy women. And so when anybody died, they wanted their dead to be buried next to these huts. And so in Gaelic, the word kill, spelled C-I-L-L, can mean a graveyard or it can mean a church. And so the notion of the Celtic church grew up around the kill, the graveyard or the church. A portal for us Celts as well could be a special time of the year. And particularly there were 4 great feasts in the Celtic calendar. We call them Imbolc, Bealtaine, Lúnasa, and Samhain. So Imbolc is the 1st of February, Bealtaine is the 1st of May, Lúnasa is the 1st of August, and Samhain is the 1st of November. And these were very special times when there was a very easy traffic both ways through the Vale, from their side to ours and from our side to theirs. But I also believe that a portal can be actually some special people, avatars, if we're lucky enough to encounter them. Certainly, we can encounter them historically, figures like Jesus or the Buddha, but sometimes we may be lucky enough to meet a person in the course of our lifetime. And I call these people, I call them walking tabernacles of mysticism, if I'm ever lucky enough to encounter such a person. So I talked about that 2 weeks ago. I talked then as well about the Catholic notion of the communion of saints. And I love the concept, but the languaging is really terrible, because according to the Catholic Church, the communion of saints has 3 parts. It is the church militant, which is us who are still on planet Earth, the church suffering, which is the souls in purgatory, and the church triumphant, which is those who have made it to heaven. I don't like that language at all. But the notion that all souls are in communion with each other is really, really important. That there is no place and no relationship that separates us either from God or from each other. And that we're all there, we're all here as part of a single family, and that we look out for each other. That the person who's in need, we attend to, and those who have particular gifts, share those gifts with others. Now, the Catholic Church then talked about this notion of purgatory, that there's some place after we die where we haven't committed a mortal sin, so we're not fit for hell, but we're not completely pure, so we can't go to heaven. So there has to be some place of refining the soul before it can ascend. Now, I believe actually that the notion of purgatory in the Catholic Church was simply a form of reincarnation, a form of ongoing purification. And in fact, reincarnation was held very strongly by the early Christian church, all the way up to the Second Council of Constantinople in 553 AD, a council which was called by the Emperor Justinian. And in that place, they condemned the notion of reincarnation. Now, it was interesting that the Pope at the time, who was invited to that meeting but chose not to attend, was a big believer in reincarnation at that stage. So purgatory for me, this notion of purgatory is simply the notion that there's a refining process that goes on from lifetime to lifetime as the soul learns to love in all circumstances, physical forms or non-physical forms. I spoke 2 weeks ago as well about the Catholic notion of indulgences. This notion that there was 2 kinds. There were partial indulgences and plenary indulgences. And the notion of the partial indulgence was that you could, by some good act or some prayer, you could reduce the sentence of a soul in purgatory by a few days or a few years, if you could cleave to Rome's protocols. And there were particular prayer protocols you had to cleave to. So, but you could actually lessen the sentence of a person in purgatory through a partial indulgence. And then there was this notion of a plenary indulgence, where you could get a full reprieve for a soul in purgatory. And to do that, there was a special day of the year, for instance, November the 2nd, the Feast of All Souls, where if you went into a church and said the Our Father, the Hail Mary, the Glory be to the Father, for the Pope's intentions, you could spring a soul out of purgatory. And especially on that one day of the year, November the 2nd, the Feast of All Souls, you could do that as frequently as you wanted on the same day. And I remember as small kids coming home from school, we'd park outside the church on our bicycles, we'd run in, say an Our Father, Hail Mary, Glory be to the Father, for the Pope's intentions, and run back out and say, wow, I got a soul out of purgatory. And then spend 10 seconds outside and rush back in again and do it all over again. And then we tally at the end of the day, how many souls did you save? How many souls did you save? So it's like a competition. How many souls did you manage to get out of purgatory? So I spoke about that notion 2 weeks ago. And then I ended 2 weeks ago by telling a story about one of the most important spiritual influences in my life. The 2 great spiritual influences were my grandfather, whom I called Daddy Jim, who was my mother's father. And then on the other side of the family, my great-grandmother, whom I called Muddy, who was my father's grandmother. So the story that Daddy Jim told me of an event that happened to him, it was November 2nd around the year 1940, the Feast of All Souls. And he works in a foundry in front of a huge, big furnace. He was a plater making agricultural instruments like forks and spades and stuff like that. And he's coming home from work And he passes the church in Blarney, and he wants to go in to try to save some souls from purgatory. And it's late in the evening when he arrives, and he sits in the church, and because it's so late in the day, and he's been working so hard, he fell asleep. And the sacristan came, not knowing there was anybody in the church, and locked up the church. So the only light is the sanctuary light at the up near the altar. He falls asleep, and all of a sudden, on the stroke of midnight, he hears a noise. And he wakes up, and there's a fully vested priest coming out of the sacristy and coming out onto the altar, and then turning around, looking down into the church and saying, "Is there anybody here who can serve my Mass?" Because in Catholic theology, a priest is not allowed to say Mass on his own. There has to be a congregation of at least one, which is the notion of an altar server. And so my grandfather woke up and says, "I will, Father." And he goes up, and he kneels down, and the priest starts in Troibo ad altare Dei. My grandfather says, "Deum qualificat juventutem meam, Dominus vobiscum, et cum spiritu tuo." So they continue the Mass in Latin. And then at the end of the Mass, the old priest turns to him, and he says, "What is your name, son?" My grandfather says, "My name is James Murphy, Father." And the old priest says to him, "I've been coming back to this church every November the 2nd for over 200 years to offer Mass, for which I accepted a stipend, but I forgot to say the Mass when I was alive. And every time I come back, either there's nobody in the church, or if there is somebody, they're scared and they run out screaming out of the church. So I can guarantee you now, James Murphy, when it's your time to cross over, I'll be there to assist you." And my grandfather died on the 4th of December in 1956, shortly after my 10th birthday. I picked up then last week with a story about my great-grandmother, whom I call Muddy. And Muddy died the same year as Daddy Jim. She died on June 6th, 1956, and he died in December. It was a really, really tough year for me as a little 10-year-old boy. But she died in 1956. And in 1993, on October the 25th, I'm now living in Palo Alto, I have this extraordinary dream where Muddy comes to me, and she's a vibrant young woman. And in the dream, I'm lying in bed. And she bends over the bed and kisses me. And then she said one single phrase. She said, "To me, I am." I couldn't make sense of it. For about a week, I'm trying to figure out what in God's name did she mean by saying, "To me, I am." And then finally I got it. She was telling me, after 37 years, she was saying, "I'm not a figment of your imagination. I'm not a memory from your past. I'm not a dream element. I exist. I'm alive." And it reminded me of the famous, encounter between Moses and the burning bush, where Moses wants to know the name of this God. And God says in Hebrew, "Ehyeh Ashir Ehyeh," which is translated as "I am who I am." In actual fact, it's a future tense in Hebrew. What God actually said was, "I will be who I will be. Whatever the situation calls for, that is how I will manifest." And this is what my great-grandmother was doing for me in some senses. So the veil for me has always been really, really thin. Last week as well, I talked about what I consider to be the 5 great traumas of life. And since I do not believe in life after death, because I don't believe in death, I believe that there are just various phases to life: pre-incarnational phases, incarnational phases, post-incarnational phases, reincarnational phases. So I don't believe in life after death because there's one life going through the entire system. But if you look at the entire trajectory, the 5 great kind of traumas, I believe, that the soul experiences are, the first one is what I call the launching pad. As souls are being readied for incarnation on a plethora of planets, all over the cosmos, there's extraordinary excitement. At the same time, there's the anxiety because we're leaving, in some senses, union with God in order to experience isolation and separation from God in some sense. So that's the first great trauma. The second one, I believe, is the merging or the docking of the soul with the zygote or with the embryo or with the fetus, depending on what stage the soul decides to merge with the spacesuit. So that now, the realization, my God, I'm stuck in this tiny little spacesuit. I don't know how to use it. I can't move my hands very much. What the hell what did I sign up for? The third great trauma, I believe, then, is the birthing process itself. The contractions begin, I'm being squeezed, the mother's cervix is still closed. There's no way out, so I'm trapped. And so the whole birthing process is traumatic. After birth, about 8 months into this new lifetime is the birth of the ego. For the first 8 months, the child is operating under the supposition that, there's only one being here, it's me. It's called the mother-child complex in psychology, that the child believes there is only me, I control the entire environment in which I live. And there's, I scream, a breast arrives, I'm cold, somebody cuddles me. But then around the age of 8 months, the child has the extraordinary dawning realization, oh my God, there's not just one of us, there are two of us, and all the power is on the other side. I can't leave her, but she can leave me. And then the fifth trauma, I believe, is our understanding of death, because we don't understand what death is. And so many people are fearful of death and don't want anything to do with it. They want to, even visit with people who are dying. So for me, they're the 5 great traumas of life. So then last week as well, I looked at the stages before we came, while we're here, as we go back and after we've returned to heaven. So what does it look like before we came, before we incarnated? So I believe that we make what I call a preconception contract. We contract to come into life, and we choose, a body, a particular body to be born into. And so with mentors or heavenly guides, we choose the appropriate body for the mission I'm undertaking. We choose our parents, our families, our friends, even our enemies, in a sense. That we draw from 2 different kinds of groups, the soul group and what I call the shadow group. Because in some senses, our enemies are even more important for our psychological and spiritual growth than our friends are. We choose as well, we choose the era of human history into which we want to parachute, because time does not exist on the other side. So in this lifetime after Seán being born in 1946, I could choose to be born as a slave girl in North Africa in the 13th century, if that's the best use of my time in my next incarnation. So we choose a particular era. We choose a location, a geographical location, meaning we're born into a particular kind of a culture, speaking a particular kind of language. We come in with gifts and talents, 2 kinds, I believe. We come in with the talents which are our gift to the world. We're like a mailman with a bunch of letters. The letters in the mailman's bag do not belong to the mailman. They belong to the people whose names are on the envelopes. So the talents we have do not belong to us. We can make a life from it, but we can't make a killing of it. So our talents do not belong to us. They're gifts God gave us and said, okay, deliver those to the world. And then there's the issues we come with, the problems we're coming to solve, and these are our gift to ourselves, because these are the guarantee that we're going to have to stretch in this incarnation and grow. We come in with particular lessons that we wanted to learn in a particular incarnation. And then we have a mission, and it's both a personal mission and a planetary mission. The first part of the mission is to wake myself up. The second part of my mission is to help wake up other people. And the third part of the mission is to wake up the planet itself to Christ consciousness. And the final thing we do in this preconception contract, I believe, is to choose possible exit strategies. How do I choose to end this particular incarnation? And we choose a few different strategies, illness or an accident or whatever. But when we get to each exit, it is the soul that will determine whether or not to take that particular exit or to wait for the next one. So that's what I mean when I say a preconception contract. So that's what it's like, I believe, as we're preparing to come here. What about while we're here? Well, now we find ourselves in these spacesuits. And we realize, in fact, that this body of mine is constantly dying. In 1 year, I will literally change 98% of the cells in my body. 98% will be gone. And in a 7-year cycle, every single cell in my body has been replaced. So if I ask myself the question, who am I? Obviously, it can't be my body, because I don't have the same body I had 7 years ago. It's a brand new body. Every single cell has been changed. Now, it's been changed according to a pre-existing blueprint. So it may look similar to it, but it's radically different from it. And so I love this Hindu saying, I have a body, but I'm not my body. I have emotions, but I'm not my emotions. I have an intellect, but I'm not even my intelligence. And I add to that, I say, I have a personality, but I'm not even my personality. Because the personality is simply the interface between the soul and the environment in which it finds itself. So you put the same soul in a different environment, a different personality will emerge. So when I answer that question for myself, who am I? I say, I am a spirit in a spacesuit. I'm a soul on safari on planet Earth. I'm a bite-sized piece of God who volunteered for a human experience. I'm a holographic fractal of source. So I have to be really, really careful not to identify with my physical self, my emotions, my intelligence, my relationships, or my profession, but to realize that I'm a holographic fractal of source itself, as is everybody else, as is every part of creation, whether they're oak trees or bunny rabbits. So as we leave, what's the process like as we leave? So death then, in the Hindu thinking, they call it the Maha Samadhi. Samadhi is a state of absolute mystical bliss. And Maha Samadhi means a great state of bliss, or a state of great bliss. And so for Hindu mystics, death was the great Maha Samadhi. Now, I think that at every death, at the end of every incarnation, there is the possibility of instant enlightenment. But the cost is the loss of separate identity, even the identity that I am a soul. Because I believe that the soul is the first illusion on the way out from God, and it is the last illusion on the way back to God. So what is the dying process like? You know, it can be a radical uprooting, or it can be a gentle evolution. And so, having had the privilege as a priest of attending on the dying on many occasions, what I've seen is that we die the same way that we live. And we transition the same way that we die. And we find ourselves on the other side in the way we transitioned, at least temporarily. And so the best indicator of how I'm going to die is to look at how I'm living. How I'm living is how I will transition. And how I transition is how I will find myself initially on the other side. There's growth there, obviously. So the more we identify with the essence, the more dying feels like going home. So after we've gone, what's the story after we've gone? Now, there are many possibilities after we've gone, after we physically shuffled off this mortal coil. And the first one is that there are some souls who are absolutely discombobulated. They don't realize they're dead. And so they're desperately trying to cling to physicality. And I shared with you last week an exorcism I was asked to do by a family on the peninsula in Palo Alto of a young boy, 11-year-old boy, who was manifesting extraordinary kind of weird stuff happening in the home, like fire starting in in boxes in the house, or pictures turning backwards to frontwards, and loud noises and stuff like that. And so with the parents present, I did a 4-hour, hypnotic system with him. And so I brought him back. I wanted to contact, the source of the difficulty. And what transpired was that the family had been in Florida a few months previously on vacation, and they were on their way back to the airport driving in a car, and they came across a serious accident in which somebody had died. And there was the traffic was at a standstill, and they're watching actually the body being taken out of the car. And what happened was the soul that inhabited that body that had just died freaked out, and didn't want to recognize it was dead, and it took possession of the psyche of this young boy. And so I got to speak directly to that spirit and explain, what happened, and that he needed to now look towards the light, go back to the light, and just leave the boy. And it worked beautifully. Thereafter, the kid was fine. So that's one reason, that there can be discombobulated souls on the other side. Another reason is addiction. That those of us who are radically addicted to something, whatever it is, and now we're dead, and we don't have a physical body in order to indulge the addiction, so we're hanging around desperately looking for some other container to inhabit so that we can indulge the addiction. That's the second reason, I believe, or discombobulated entities. A third one is that the person who has gone has a concern for those left behind, like a mother who died in childbirth. And now the baby is motherless, and the mother desperately wants to be there for the child. And so she's hanging around for the sake of the baby, and she needs to be released on her own journey. And then finally, fourthly, the notion of our need for them. That we don't want to let the dead, we don't want to let them go. Don't leave me, don't leave me, don't leave me. And this was the great story that you find in John's Gospel in chapter 20 with Jesus and Mary Magdalene. When Mary comes to the tomb on Sunday morning and she sees this figure outside the tomb, And she doesn't recognize him because the sun is in her eyes and she's been crying and her tears are refracting her vision. And she thinks he's the gardener. And she says, can you tell if you've moved the body, can you tell me where you put it? I go, I take it back. And Jesus speaks her secret, sacred name. Every one of us leaves heaven with a secret, sacred name. He didn't call her Mariam. He called her by her secret, sacred name. And she recognized him immediately. And then she fired herself at him and clung to him. And Jesus says to her, Mary, don't cling to me. I need to ascend to my Father. Go back and tell my sisters and my brothers that I am arisen. And so sometimes our need for them is what holds them on this side. And then last week I looked at the main schools. What are the ideas of an afterlife? And the first one is kind of what I call the WYSIWYG model from computer science. WYSIWYG, what you see is what you get. This notion, that it's just lights out. Death is lights out, and you don't exist after that. That's the end of the problem. Then there's the kind of the view of monotheists. Monotheists believe there's only one life and one death. And so, according to Catholic teaching, when a zygote is formed with the union of a sperm and an egg, God creates a brand new soul and infuses it into the zygote or into the fetus or into the embryo, depending on your viewpoint. And you have just one shot at it, and then you die. And then there's a judgment. And then you go to either heaven or purgatory or limbo or hell. So there's no pre-existence of the soul and there's no reincarnation. So that's the monotheistic viewpoint. The one I hold to very definitely is a reincarnational model, that there's a pre-life, a pre-mortal life, there's a mortal life, there's a post-mortal life, and there's a new, immortal life. We reincarnate constantly until the soul learns how to love in all circumstances. The final point I made then, I call it good heavens. What does heaven actually feel like? Those who have gone, and aren't kind of stuck in Earth orbit. Now, I build this belief system on the 7 levels of body that we encounter in Hinduism. According to Hinduism, there are 7 levels to our body. There's the gross body that's vibrating between 400 and 700 nanometers, so we can see it and touch it. Then there's the etheric body, the energy system, which is vibrating at a higher frequency, which is kind of the blueprint for incarnation. And then there's the astral body, which is our emotional body and the place we inhabit during our dreaming. Then there's the mental body, the place of the Platonic archetypes. Then there's the causal body, where we experience our psychic gifts. Then there's Atman, which is the individual soul. And then finally there's Brahman, which is a cosmic consciousness. Now I think the version of heaven we experience after death is dependent upon how we've grown in our incarnation through these different stages. If I'm still stuck, if my earth life has been concerned totally with my physicality, so I'm into food and sex and wines and whatever, and there's nothing wrong with these, but if that's my total reason for being, then I think the only level of heaven I can experience on the other side is fast food and 72 virgins. If I've managed to get to the etheric level during this lifetime and moving into my energy system, then I can use that energy to move freely in the universe. Just simply by thinking energetically of where I want to be, I make it happen. If I've operated on the astral level of my body during my lifetime, then heaven consists, I think, of emotional meetings with my family and my dead loved ones. That's what heaven looks like. It's just this extraordinary homecoming and family gathering again. If I've managed to reach the mental level of the archetypal place, then I can say with St. Paul, eye has not seen, nor ear heard, nor has it even entered into the heart of people what things God has prepared for those who love him, then that means that is what I can create on the other side. If I've managed to reach the causal level, the psychic level during lifetime, then literally you can create your own reality, absolutely your own reality. If you've reached the soul level that you've identified with your soul self during lifetime, then literally you become a creator of your own universes. And finally, if you've managed to identify with cosmic consciousness and realize that we're all bite-sized pieces of God, then we merge completely. And now, instead of being a single wave, you are the ocean itself. Namaste, my brothers and sisters. So let's open it up to a Q&A.
I just was wondering if you had maybe thought about, we have our shadow pod
Yes.
and then the other pod, that I was wondering if they maybe switch in lifetimes. The connection is to you, that they come in one time as a shadow pod and one time as your core support pod. I mean, because even in this lifetime, people can sometimes start as one and go to the other, it seems. But I just was wondering if you had thought about that.
Yes, I have. And it's a brilliant question, Joanna. And you're absolutely right. Because every life we come into, every incarnation is improv theater. We've chosen the people with whom we want to be on stage, and we've chosen a particular kind of mission. But the idea is, how best can the mission be accomplished? And therefore, it may well be that in one lifetime, somebody who was a great, great friend of mine turns out to be a very difficult person in a new incarnation. And that's by agreement, that we've agreed to kind of test each other in various ways. Because I've said many times that, our enemy figures are possibly even more important than our friends. If we're surrounded with people who love us unconditionally, we become narcissists. On the other hand, if we're surrounded only with people who don't like us and hate us, then we cringe and we shrivel up. And so it's an important mixture. So I've used the story many times of when I was living in Kenya and I was working with people who were nomadic pastoralists traditionally. They had no kind of tradition of agriculture whatsoever. So I was training them how to kind of be agriculturalists. And we chose to kind of grow maize or a corn on the cob, what you hear. And they would go out as a family of 4 people. And the first guy would have a long pointed stick and he'd jab a hole in the ground every 6 inches. The second guy would go after him with a bag of maize kernels and he'd drop 2 kernels into each hole. The third guy, if the family could afford it, and not all families could, would have a bag of artificial fertilizer, powdered fertilizer, and a spoon. And he'd take a spoon of fertilizer and put it into each hole. And the fourth guy would just come and cover up the hole with his foot, and they walk behind each other. And then after about 6 weeks, the young maize would be maybe 1.5 feet high, and they'd weed it. And then after 3 months, it would be maybe 3.5, 4 feet high. They'd weed it again. And then after 4 months, they'd harvest it. And I would take them in for the seminars as their priest and as their agricultural instructor. And the question I would ask is, if you had to choose between weeding your maize and fertilizing it, and you want to optimize your harvest, which is the more important? If you had to choose between them, which is the more important, the weeding or the fertilizing? And at first they were just guessing, but after a few years they got it every time. Weeding is far more important, than fertilizing, because fertilizer is blind. You live on the equator, with kind of torrential rains for 3 months of the year, you're going to get a forest around the maize. You're not going to get any maize. So weeding is more important if you have to choose one. So in some senses then, when Christ says, love your enemies, that is what he means. He means there are going to be weeders in your life. Embrace the weeders. The weeders are going to help you grow even more than the fertilizers will love you. So yes, I think we choose different characters to create improv theater from lifetime to lifetime, and that these people can play different roles. And so the notion of belonging to a shadow pod or belonging to a soul pod is just an artificial way of saying, who am I going to find difficult in this life and who will be a friend to me in this life.
When you were talking about the young boy and the energy that had set with him, and you were kind of talking about these different things that caused that, you had brought up something about addiction. It's something that I've struggled with for 15 years off and on. And so could you expand on that a little bit? I think that you were talking more as we pass on to the next part after death. Maybe I'm wrong. But if you could just talk a little bit more about that, because I'm interested in hearing what you have to say on that.
Great, that's a great question, Wesley, and you're right on. So there's a great book by a guy called George Ritchie. It's called Return from Tomorrow. And it's a story about George Ritchie himself was a psychiatrist attached to the University of Virginia. And he did great research. But this experience of in 1941, he was drafted into the military, and he's in boot camp. And while in boot camp, he was drinking in a pub with a bunch of other servicemen. And he saw this scene where there's a whole bunch of Navy guys and there are Air Force guys and there are Army guys inside in this public place. And the floor is covered with sawdust and there's hundreds of guys crammed into it. And there's this one young man walking across the floor. He's got 2 pints of porter in his hands, and he slips and falls and bangs his head off the ground. And he said in the pub, he could see 2 different kinds of beings. They all look human, but one group had no aura. The others had auras that were glistening, radiating out from their physical body. And there was others who had no aura whatsoever. And he said, as soon as the guy fell, his aura shrank. He went unconscious. And one of the others dived in through the crown of his head and took occupancy of his body. And when the experience was that these were disincarnate entities who were addicted to alcohol in this case. But in order to indulge that addiction, they needed physical body, to be able to drink beer. So not being able to do that, they're looking for opportunities to find a victim, who's a kind of vulnerable in some way. And so that would be true then of any kind of physiological addiction. That if my addiction is controlling my life to the extent that I live my life in order to indulge the addiction, then obviously everything else like relationships and work schedule and spirituality goes by the wayside. And so when I die then, I'm still looking for that fix, and I'm not looking for the light, I'm looking for the fix. And the only way I can indulge the fix is by finding some kind of a vulnerable victim with whom I can cohabit and kind of dive into their space. And so, but it's a temporary state because there are beings at the other side, angelic beings, whose mission is to rescue these discombobulated entities. But we still have free will at the other side. They can't be forced to the light. They have to be kind of encouraged to look towards it and to move towards it finally. And so that is a great ministry of some kinds of guardian angels at the other side. But it's a really dangerous place to be. And so in Hindu philosophy, there's this notion of the astral realms. They call the lower astral realms and the upper astral realms. So the lower astral realms are inhabited by disincarnate, discombobulated souls recently departed. And the upper realms are inhabited by angelic beings. And so I liken it to it's like the belt between Mars and Jupiter. If you're launching a satellite, it's like there's all these rocks in space that you have to try to avoid. So being able to avoid the kind of the lower astral realms becomes really, really important. And so I have a practice for years where, as I'm going to sleep at night, I ask, I want to be guided and healed by the angelic beings and by great avatars, and I volunteer to be of assistance to beings who are stuck in the lower astral realms, but don't get me into stuff that I can't handle. Don't get me in over my head. Give me a task I'm capable of doing. But I want to see if I can kind of add my energy to freeing some of these souls. So there are some of the ideas that come up for me, Wesley.
My question for today is, you were speaking about the various energetic realms,
right,
and our ability to connect with them here, then
right.
opens up the possibility to connect with them there, here,
Yes.
there, here.
Yes.
And so I'm curious about sustained connectivity, because
Yes.
sometimes, or the gift of touching something so high,
Yes.
but then then you got to take out your trash and do the do the normal stuff. So like, I guess the question is how to either create a more sustained, or how often does one's interaction with the higher and higher realms need to occur in order to have developed the ability or access, or I'm not sure exactly how to phrase that, but
You're doing a great, Alicia.
cross.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm going to use kind of a metaphor for a moment. I don't know your circumstances, but imagine a woman who's a wife, she's a mother of children, and she's a professional woman, and she's interested in sports of some kind as well. And now she's juggling all these 4 pieces. And the question is, what kind of a combination of what kind of energy can she devote to each of these activities, and how can she make them mesh together so that none of them is kind of suffering from the others? And so in some senses, all of these levels are available to us all the time. The question then becomes, if I plug into the highest level, can I actually sustain, driving a car or tying my shoelaces? Probably not. And so I need to realize, there's a time and a place to be plugged into these different levels. They're always available, but in order to kind of move from level to level, I have to have some kind of a transformer. And so, for instance, like here in the States, if you plug in your hairdryer here in the States, it's operating on 125, volts. You take that to Europe and you plug it in, it's going to blow the system because they operate on 240 volts. So we need these transformers between the levels. So part of spiritual practice is to build in transformers. And that's exactly what the chakra system is. The chakras in the body are really transformers where they take energy from source and they kind of step it down, right down to the physicality. Because if we were totally open to the energy of source, we would literally explode our physical containers. We couldn't do it. And moreover, we couldn't sustain just simple tasks like stopping at red lights and paying our taxes. And so the practice then is somehow, can I keep those transformers active so that whatever level I need to operate at this stage of the day or this time of the week, I can do it. And I can kind of downplay the energy sufficiently that I can be totally present, 100% present to this particular level. So obviously it's developing those transformers, those kind of chakra systems.
My question kind of tags onto the back of Johanna's about soul groups and shadow groups. A lot of people in my life belong to both.
Yes. Okay.
I mean, there's a few that are only to one or the other, but the deepest, most meaningful relationships are both. I just wanted to ask you about that, like it's not either or.
That's brilliant. That's brilliant. You're absolutely right, because in some senses, these are totally artificial categorizations of enemies and friends. Ultimately, there is only God, and we are God's dream. And these are characters in God's dream. So when you dream at night, for instance, and you create a protagonist of some kind, and a kind of an enemy figure of some kind, so as to kind of give a storyline to the dream, all of the characters in your dream are very important. There wouldn't be a dream if one of the characters disappeared. And so it becomes very important to understand that all of these other souls, all of whom are bite-sized pieces of God, and that ultimately we're simply a dream that God is having. And so in order for God to generate experiences, she needs to have different characters in her dreams, and they need to interact in different ways in order to kind of create the full potentiality of the divine in manifestation. And so you're absolutely right, to call anybody friend or enemy in some senses is to artificially pigeonhole what is a fellow soul, what is a fellow bite-sized piece of God. So they're literally artificial kind of categorizations. And it well behooves us to grow beyond those and to regard anybody as an enemy figure, to realize, that we're playing a drama to which all of the participants have agreed to participate. And so there's nobody in your life and there's no situation in your life which is not there to afford you the opportunity to grow. So there are no enemies and there are no friends. There are only opportunities to harvest it for love.
Do you believe that souls can make a decision right before or at the moment of passing that they will choose to stay around? Because I really believe that my sister made that choice. I've had a lot of people that I've been close to. Most recently, a super dear friend of mine in the last month and a half who passed from COVID. He just didn't wake up. He had a heart. I guess his heart just failed in his sleep. But my sister Kathy, I really firmly believe that she chose to check back in, because she does check back in, and nobody else really does that on a really fairly frequent basis. I mean, and some of it is it's not profound like your when your great grandmother or Moody checked in with you and told you, but it was I mean, she'll check in on kind of some of the silliest, funniest things. It's like we'll share a joke, and I'm like, it's not even my sense of humor, but I know it's hers. And it's so, on the way to visit her at the cemetery, Seán, way out in Hamlin, West Virginia, going to visit her gravesite, I always clean up her grave and make sure it's maintained. And, and as I'm driving out there, she goes, I'm not here.
So there's a very big difference between checking in and being stuck. So souls on the other side are totally free to check in and to radiate us with their love. And that's the whole notion of the communion of saints in the Catholic thinking, that because somebody is on the other side, even in the presence of God, that they're not also present to us and vitally concerned with our progress. So your sister checking in, even in kind of silly instances, is energizing you and making you feel loved. So that's very different from being stuck to
Okay.
some form of addiction. So you're absolutely right. They're never separated from us. They're always, part of the communion of saints. There is no place we can be where we're not radiated with the love of those who've gone before us. But it's the difference between somebody with the abilities to kind of add something beautiful to our lives and some people who are there just as sycophants, literally sucking the energy from us, which would be a discombobulated entity that hasn't moved on. Great question, Chris.
Seán, I've got a question in the chat. If we had a near-death experience and had a disembodied entity attached to us, was that part of our soul agreement as well? Do we need exorcism? How do we even know if we have an attachment of an entity?
Okay. So I believe, thanks, Elizabeth. I believe that there are no entities that attach themselves to us on an ongoing basis and become part of our, our life journey. Every soul has its own trajectory. And as Chris just said, they may check in with us. And as the community of saints, they may continue to offer us kind of assistance from time to time. But the idea that that there is an attachment, that they're that take up occupancy of our psyche, that's a form of if not possession, a form of obsession. In Catholic theology, there's a huge big difference between kind of the remote influences of, let's say, poltergeist activity that are just messing our environment, and on one hand, and then the next stage up would be kind of obsession that we're constantly thinking about particular kinds of stuff that don't really belong to us, and then possession where the spirit has taken over the psyche completely. So they're very, very different. And in fairness to Catholic exorcists at this stage, they're very highly trained in psychiatry. And so the first thing that anybody will do, an exorcist will do now, if somebody feels like they're possessed in some way, the first thing they will do is to make sure this person has undergone significant physical examinations by an MD to make sure there's not just a kind of a hormonal issue going on here, or some part of the body which is malfunctioning and creating this notion. And then they have to see a psychologist for an evaluation as to their mental state. And if there's no accounting psychologically or physiologically for what they're experiencing, then and only then will they consider an exorcism. And there have to be kind of really dramatic signs, like somebody speaking, dead languages, or somebody kind of literally walking up a wall, or somebody levitating. And so in the absence of these extraordinary physical kind of demonstrations, Catholic exorcists will not do an exorcism at this stage. And so we have to learn to distinguish then between obsessive thinking. Sometimes it's just OCD. I can't let go of something. I have to organize kind of the knives in my drawers to make sure they're all pointing in the same direction. Or all my socks, are turned to the back of the closet rather than the front of the closet. So I have to make sure that it's just not some form of OCD that's happening. So I have to rule all of these out. And if it's anything short of possession, there are spiritual techniques and psychological techniques that can free yourself from that kind of obsessive intrusion.
When I moved to Taos, I connected with the native world. There's a vast level of alcoholism among native people. And it has created a situation of, some really dangerous combinations of native medicine power, psychic power, and the use of these entities. And I had some extremely, extremely scary experiences in which some strange things, like at one point, I had odd things flying around in my house, and my bedding actually tried to strangle me. I didn't sleep at all one night, and I had this vision of several entities which were very clearly feeding off of human negative emotions and fear. And I really got this sense of, it's like they suddenly realized that I saw them and they were terrified. It was like, oh no, people don't see us. And they were like, they were made of like a very dark smoke. In other words, they were literally visible, but you could put your fist through them.
Yeah.
And what they did was feed on negative human emotions.
I get exactly what you're saying, Marty.
Yeah.
Brilliant of you. And so you put your finger right on it, the kind of the sources of this. So there are many different kinds of sources. Addiction itself per se is always a gateway to some kind of activity or intrusion from dark forces that exist. That's one thing. The second thing is, you're absolutely right, living where you live. Living in a community that has been kind of so badly oppressed by the colonization process, you know, in the 1800s, early 1900s, that they resorted to alcohol and therefore made themselves much more amenable to that. You build upon that, then in many indigenous cultures, there literally is, you know, there's a dance that the shaman does between the worlds, between the upper world, the lower world, and the middle world. And that, you know, you get the whole notion, for instance, of the skinwalker or the shapeshifter in many Native American Indian traditions. And then you add to that the Buddhist notion of the tulpa, that literally everything I think, everything I say, everything I do creates an energy, you know, and literally I'm creating energy forms as an individual person. And we're creating energy forms as a family system. We're creating energy forms as a culture. We're creating energy forms as a human, you know, species. And so there are these various levels of darkness, dark tulpas, literally energy beings who then interact physiologically and psychologically and spiritually with us. And so we have to be really, really careful how we kind of how we dance with our own darkness, how we dance with our own personal shadow material, how we navigate through the shadow of a culture, and how we navigate through the shadow of a species. So it becomes very, very important then that we engage in the kind of spiritual practices that dissolve that level of darkness within ourselves, firstly, that we have to work with our own shadow material, and the realization that the shadow, according to Jung, is 80% gold. It is 80% unrealized potential. So it's not just about batting away the bad stuff, you know, and then hoping to live a happy life. It's about, you know, encouraging and developing the light within. And so light practices as communities, as individuals, is the best way of countermanding these. But certainly planet Earth itself is under assault from kind of disincarnate entities. We got a great statement in, I think it's Paul's letter to the Galatians in chapter 6, where he says, our battle is not against the forces of this world, but by the dark forces of the heavens. And so literally, I told you many times I seed my dreams before I sleep at night, and I pose a question, you know, to my higher self or to God, looking for an answer. And a few years ago, I asked this simple question before I went to sleep. Can you tell me the difference between sin and evil? And I woke up at 4 o'clock, and the answer was crystal clear. Yes, sin is the individual transgression of a culturally created precept. Sin is just breaking a human law. Evil is a cosmic conspiracy using human intermediaries to separate souls from source. So there literally are disincarnate entities whose function is to separate souls from source. It's the kind of the Luciferian, you know, notion of non serviam, I will not serve God. So we have to be really, really careful that every area has an energy form. You know, downtown New York has a specific form of darkness. You know, Taos, New Mexico has a particular form of its darkness. Every place you go, the question is, am I contributing to that, or am I helping to dissolve that? Am I bringing life work or energy into that situation and helping to dissolve it? And it is a struggle, because you're going to pay a price, sometimes physiologically, as you did being strangled, sometimes sociologically, you know, people distancing themselves from you, and sometimes psychologically, and sometimes spiritually. So it's the battle between light and dark. It is the function of the light carrier. When you volunteer for incarnation, you come down here to bring light and to dissolve the dark.
Yes. There's one other thing that I think made this come up for me, really, is I feel like a lot of that is going on since the election, that there's a real battle going on right now.
So our response to that must be to bring light into the situation. Firstly, to ourselves, to shine light on my own fears, because I'm no good to anybody if I'm operating out of fear.
Father Seán, can you help us to wake up to our identity as Atman and any grounded steps we can take each day for that permanent awareness?
Right. So there are many, many practices, the kind of the essence of translating mystical spirituality into everyday living is some kinds of practices. So the ones I've advocated in the past, the first one obviously is meditation, where I shift my mindset where I transcend my physicality in order to engage with higher levels of myself. One I've advocated again and again and again is spending time, quality time with little children, particularly children between age 2 and 5, because they're living in a thin place. They walk through the veil many, many times, and we misunderstand their use of imagination for the notion of fantasy. And I've distinguished between these. There's a huge difference between fantasy and imagination. Fantasy is the ability to make up stuff that's not real. Imagination is the ability to shift my state of consciousness, enter through the veil, interact with entities that reside at the other side of the veil, learn from them, and then bring it back and share it on this side of the veil. So watching little children at play and engaging in their play, not patting them on their head kind of patronizingly, say, oh yeah, that's nice. Get into them. They're going to lead you through the veil. You're going to see things through their eyes. A third one for me, very important, is spending quality time in nature alone. You can't be walking with somebody and having a conversation, because nature is not going to reveal its secrets to you if you're making noise. So being out in nature, so I would say to begin with, there are 3 very, very important practices. Let me add the fourth one. And we got this from Margaret Parra today, the notion of gratitude. I remember a client of mine a few weeks ago saying, I have hope for the future. And I said to him, there's a much more important virtue than hope, because hope is simply a fear-tinged expectation for the future, whereas gratitude is the present tense celebration of the now. So there's a practice Margaret gave us this morning, this ability to be grateful, that gratitude creates joy. It's not joy that creates gratitude, it's gratitude that creates joy. So there'd be 4 straight off the bat.